Good afternoon, everyone. I am pleased to welcome you to today's webinar with Anthony Tascal, who will be presenting on the golden thread, why numbers numb us, but stories stir us. So in a moment, I'll pass over to Taz to start the webinar, but before I do, I'd just like to let you know that the session will have a Q&A section at the end. So if you have any questions throughout the session, please type them into the question tab, and we hopefully get a chance to answer all the questions at the end. For any unanswered questions, don't worry, Taz has kindly agreed to reach out following the webinar with his answers. Also, the session is being recorded, so a week from today, you'll all receive an email from Amber and BGA, which will include the link to access this session. And obviously, if you have any questions prior to obviously receiving this email, please feel free to contact us. So without further ado, I'll pass over to Taz, who will be able to begin the session. So over to you, Taz.
Cheers, thanks Paul. Hello everybody. I don't know where you're all located around the world, but it's just after midday in the UK and it's muggy and it's a bit annoying. But I want to talk to you about storytelling, which is one of my favourite topics. So as Paul said, the title is Why Numbers Numb Us, but Stories Stir Us. So my argument is really quite simple, which is that in our business, across all sorts of different domains, territories, markets, the disciplines, we spend way too much time thinking about numbers, and we don't spend anything like as much time thinking about how we tell stories. So let me just give you a brief introduction. I never know what to call myself anymore, so I've gone with man of many lanyards, since I have loads of them all over my house. But that's a metaphor really for the fact that I work across lots of different domains. I started off working in the ad industry. I still work directly with ad agencies and clients. For those of you who perhaps are unaware, this wonderful building, this august building on the top left-hand corner, is London's Royal Albert Hall. They're 150 years old this year. Happy birthday. And I've been working with them to tell their story over the last 2 or 3 years. At the other end of the spectrum, I also work with tech companies, including one from Seattle, which obviously I can't name. I do an awful lot with market research companies. So again, I don't know if any of you use data or research, but I spend a lot of time helping them tell stories from their data. I lecture at a number of universities in the UK and one in China, although probably not one in China for a while. And I train for different organisations such as the CIM, Civil Service College, etc. And as I said, I still have one foot in the ad agency world. There are 3 books I've done. This is the first one, a book about storytelling, helpfully called The Storytelling Book. This is from a bookshop in London, and as you can see, I was 3 books away from Vince Cable. The second book is a book about insight and inspiration. This is from London's Tate Modern, and again, you can see my book here on the left of Noam Chomsky. And for anyone who knows Noam Chomsky, it's really hard to be on the left of Noam Chomsky. I can't hear any comments, but please let me know if you're getting this. And this is the new book that came out last year. It's a collection of quotations, expressions, and words, and what we can learn from them. And as I say, the book came out at a time when people couldn't. Anyone interested in classics, let me know on the questions or on the chat. Before I went into the industry, I was a classicist, so I spent a lot of my time with Homer, Virgil, and Nero. If you like anything I'm saying today, please follow me or put any comments on Twitter. I'm at Taswell Hill. If you don't like anything I'm saying, it's at Piers Morgan. I'm going to give you a brief summary, really, of some of the things I'm going to talk about. It's going to be a little bit odd, a little bit different, I like to think. I'm going to talk about 16th century French philosophers. I'm going to talk about the BBC series Line of Duty, and we'll also talk about sponges. So hopefully not your average presentation. I talk an awful lot in storytelling about the magic number 3. We all know the power of 3s. Veni, vidi, vici, liberté, égalité, fraternité, 3 wise men, 3 blind mice. The number of times you are a lady. So you'll see a few 3s during my presentation. So this is the structure for today. Firstly, why is it that we need to go beyond facts and information? It's just a myth, an illusion that facts and information and data are enough to convince or influence our audiences. Secondly, why is it that stories work, and also why have we forgotten about them when we're doing presentations, when we're writing PowerPoint decks? when we're delivering speeches. And then I'll end up with Taz's top tips for telling tales, which I can probably just about say now once. And I think I'm going to give you probably 3 top tips, including my expression, the golden thread. So let's kick off. And please, as Paul said, at any point, if this provokes any thought or questions, please put them in the questions or the chat, and we'll try and deal with it at the end, or maybe even after today. So why do I think that facts and information are not enough? Because we're living in a time of cornucopia of facts. We are drowning in facts and information. And I mentioned I was going to show you this French philosopher. Here he is, Blaise Pascal. You may not know him, but you may know what he said. By the way, if there are any Americans listening, you can say that it was said by Mark Twain, although it wasn't. He famously said this in the 17th century. I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. Why? Because it's so much easier. It's so much easier to write something that is long and rambling and incoherent. It is much harder to write and create something which is short, pithy, concise, and persuasive. And unfortunately, in an era where we are overloaded with facts and information, we are all very, very tempted to create content which is way too long and way too fluffy. Excuse me. In fact, we're living in a world that I call DRIP, talking about drowning in data. DRIP stands in my world for data-rich insight pool. Again, please put it on Twitter if you're so interested. Data-rich insight pool. We are all craving, clients, teachers, students, governments, politicians are craving insight, something which will change the way that we see things, the way that we do things. But unfortunately, data does not just translate into insight. Insight is a much more creative, much more storytelling-led process. In fact, we're living, again, if you want to use this word, please do. We're living in a world that I've called an arithmocracy, not a democracy or aristocracy, but a system which is obsessed with numbers. Arithmos, the Greek word for numbers. And I've got 2 ways of looking at what I call arithmocracy. The fact that, again, any client, any government, any public sector organization, we spend way too much emphasis on numbers and data and nowhere near enough focus on story and getting people emotionally involved in what we're trying to tell them about. I also think arithmocracy leads to a system, or is a system, where we become obsessed with metrics and targets. And that often leads to what I've called an arid reductionism, that we reduce the messiness, the emotion, the complexity of human behavior to a target, a number, a mean, an average. Again, happy to take questions on this later. I'm also, even though I'm a classicist, I'm obsessed with science and what science tells us about human behavior, the brain. And I think part of the problem is that we often try and convince ourselves in our marketing, in our communication, that human beings are actually the products of physics or mathematics and engineering, that we're like atoms, they're all the same. And if you know roughly where an atom is, you apply pressure to it, you know exactly where it will move to. Clearly, that's not how human beings work. Instead, we are the products of biology, psychology, and culture. It's much more messy, it's much more unpredictable than people who obsess with physics and mathematics would like to think. Let me give you a quote from an economist. I do not like my quotes, obviously, books, presentations. Herbert Simon was a famous Nobel Prize winning economist. And this is, I think, something like 50, 60 years old. In other words, the more information we have, the less attention we can pay to it. And as I said, that was said even before the internet was a thing. So imagine when you're trying to present, imagine when you're trying to convince people. The risk is the more information you give people, the harder it is for them to pay attention to that. Again, that's not what we were told. We were told, give people lots of facts, give people lots of information. It doesn't seem to work that way, because we now know from neuroscience how the brain works. And I like to think that the brain is not a sponge. It doesn't absorb infinite amounts of information. It's also not a computer. It doesn't have switches. It's not digital. It doesn't have infinite processing power. and also computers don't have bodies. So those are very, very misleading metaphors. If you want me to give another metaphor or analogy for the brain, your wish is granted. I like to think of the brain as an ignoring machine. So when you're thinking about talking to your audience, to your clients, your stakeholders, possibly even your wives, husbands, and children, think of their brain not as something that is automatically going to listen to everything you say, but that is actually going to try and ignore what you are saying. And why am I saying that? If you look at just one simple fact about the brain is only about 1 kilo or so. So on average, it's about 2% of the average person's body weight. But it needs something like 20 to 20%, 25% of all the energy that the brain takes in. This is what we call behavioural economics. I'm going to show you another chart in a second. What does that mean? It means that we've got to stop thinking of the brain, as I said, as a computer. We need to think of the brain as a filtering device, but as an organism or an organ that is energy efficient. The brain is always trying to do things which are energy efficient and effortless, which is why we often find ourselves making decisions and choices which aren't necessarily the best decision, but are certainly the easiest decision. So again, this is another reason why just flooding people with data and facts is just not going to work. I've mentioned these misleading metaphors already, so I'm not going to go through them. But again, please stop imagining the brain as a sponge. Also, stop using the analogy of the brain as a computer. They're very misleading, they're very unhelpful, and they lead us to create long presentations, long documents, long pitches, which at the end of the day, we know will fail to emotionally involve our audience. Now, I think I promised you some behavioural economics, so I'm just going to give you like one slide. Again, if you're interested in this, ask me some questions. And clearly, I run training days on behavioural economics, storytelling, insight as well, if you're interested. I wish I'd said this first line, excuse me, a man called David Eagleman did. Impossibly bright neuroscientist from Texas and also irritatingly handsome. He says we don't think the way we think, which I think is a beautifully articulated way of talking about how the brain works. We like to think, don't we, that our brain is rational, is logical, that we do things in a very considered, Rodin-esque way, that we're independent, that we think freely. But again, you can tell from the veneer of English sarcasm in my voice that that's pretty much not what behavioural economics, psychology, social psychology, neuroscience shows us. Instead, we are far more influenced by emotions. Emotions trump, I shouldn't use that word probably now, trump information, and also emotions create memories. So again, a lot of what we're trying to do is create memories of what we are saying, what we are doing, what we want people to remember. As I've said, the brain actually values effortlessness over other things. For example, dare I say this, truth. Truth doesn't come out very well in behavioural economics. As I said, the brain tends to want things which are effortless, which are coherent, and which fit with what it already believes in. Hence, as many of you will know, the term confirmation bias. Our brain goes out of the way simply to choose information that confirms what it already believes. Again, I can give you a whole day on this, but we talk an awful lot about the different emotions, one of which is surprise. And the role of surprise is to cut through the attentional overload that we have. So again, we need to think a lot more about engaging, creating surprise in our audience, in our presentations, in our documents, in our speeches. And also, emotion is the heart of creating empathy. And I'll talk a bit later about storytelling, because storytelling is all about those two E's, emotions and empathy. Storytelling is all about touching, engaging, amplifying human emotions. And storytelling is nothing if it's not about creating empathy, which again is something that we try and do when we're trying to influence or persuade people. I think my final point on behavioural economics is this. Some of you may know this. Again, please ask me questions. There are considered to be two basic systems that operate in the brain at the same time, very different systems. System 2 is much more rational, considered, the pilot. System 1 is much more unconscious. It's where most of who we are lives, where the emotions live, and it's sometimes known as the autopilot. We like to think System 2 is in charge, but spoiler alert, System 1 is largely running the show. And again, bear this in mind, System 1 is largely unconscious. So I think I'm going to come to the end of my first section by leaving you with this expression. And before any of you ask me, it is a typo, but it's a deliberate one now. If you look at your keyboards, yeah, you'll see the letters N and M are next to each other. So this was originally a mistake that I made when I was typing, but I've now slightly fallen in love with it as an expression. Because for me, attention span is a way of describing the difference between how we communicate and how we think we communicate. So we like to think that we are communicating things that are coming from my attention inbox in my head to your attention inbox. But again, I just think that the science suggests that's not true. Most of what we say, most of what we communicate or create, I think goes into what I now call attention span. So one of the tasks we have when we're creating any form of persuasion, document, PowerPoint, pitch, how do we get through our audience's attention span? And surprise, surprise, I'm going to suggest that storytelling is one of the best ways to do that. So I'm going to give you what I think is a really good t-shirt slogan. I don't know if any of you have got parties, summer parties coming up, work parties, home, whatever. This makes a really good t-shirt. And it is the title of the presentation. So numbers numb us, but stories stir us. So what I'm talking about really is a change of focus, a change of emphasis. I want us to worry a bit less about prove, but I want us to worry a lot more about move. And again, as a classicist, I'm obsessed with etymology and language. Move, motion, they come from the same roots as emotion. So that's what emotion is. It's moving people. And again, that's really what I want to talk about for the rest of this talk. So that's the end of part one. Why facts and information by themselves will never convince people and persuade people and influence people to the extent that we think. So let me talk about why it is that stories work. Because when I left the world of Homer and Virgil and Juvenal and Catullus and Cicero, I went into the advertising industry. I thought everyone would be doing great presentations and write great documents, and I was really disappointed. I thought some of the stuff that people presented was really poor. It was really dull, it was really boring, it was very uninvolving and unemotional. So I went back to my sort of interest in stories and thought, okay, how can we learn, or how can we relearn maybe, some of the things about how stories work and bring that in to our presentations and communications. So again, I'm going to talk about three things I think in this section. The first thing is that stories filter and simplify. As children, we learn about the world, not through long series of information and documents and PowerPoint. At least I don't think parents do that. I certainly didn't. Some parenting tips for you today. Don't try and educate your children through PowerPoint. But we do it through stories. Children read stories, we read them stories, we enjoy it, we learn, they learn. And then when we become parents ourselves, we transmit that to the next generation. Because stories are what I call brain shaped. They seem to work in a way that our brain understands, not with data, not with facts, not with graphs, not with infographics. Because, storytelling simplifies because it offers a way for the brain to take information and organize it in a way that is easy for the brain. It's not, to use the term beloved of behavioural economists, cognitively burdensome. It's not very hard to process. Daniel Kahneman, who some of you may know, who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow, says we are all cognitive misers. Our brains don't want to spend any more time processing stuff than they have to. And stories are really easy for the brain to process. Again, I'm just going to give you a flavour of this. Hopefully you can ask me questions or we can follow up afterwards. And stories are also how we learn about the world. Not just as children, but as we grow older, we learn about things which we may not be able to experience, but we can rehearse how we would behave in a particular way, how to be a good person, how to fit into our tribe, our faith, our religion, our group, our team. It's Man United in England, by the way, for me. And they act as a form of practice. Secondly, storytelling above all makes us what? Storytelling, I think, makes us human, makes us emotionally involved, makes us interested. Yes, all of those things. But I think above all, storytelling makes us care. And again, I think that's really important, whether you're writing a communication, whether you're a marketing or a brand person, you want people to care about your company, your brand, your culture, your presentation. And for me, that's just what story is. It's all about empathy and caring. I don't have to show you anything. I could show you this from a few years ago. I don't have to say anything because your brain, your system one, is already thinking of this as a story, a tragedy. You're feeling emotions, sadness, bitter anger. You're feeling about how you think about the refugee problem, about issues to do with all things in that area. And stories, whether they're words or whether they're pictures, have that ability to make us feel and make us care without us even knowing. And thirdly, stories share. We share stories, we share learning through stories. I don't think I showed a picture at the beginning. One of my other hats, one of my other lanyards. I've been a trustee of a cinema in North London called the Phoenix. Again, anyone let me know if they've heard of North London, been to North London, been to the Phoenix. Excuse me, the oldest continued running cinema in the UK, built in 1910. What do we go to the cinema for? To share stories, to share emotions with other people, to laugh together, cry together, jump out of fear together. But also, as I said, stories shape the way that we see things. They shape the way that we see the world. I've been doing some work, funny enough, with a company of lawyers department, and they talk about how, again, they shape how the jury or the judge thinks about their case by shaping and forming a story from all the evidence that they have. But not just lawyers, we all do it. And in fact, we all should do it. I'll end this section with a bit of fun, because I use an expression. I think stories work for us because they are what I call patterns with meaning. Our brain is used to looking for patterns. Again, going back to our evolutionary past, it's important that our brain cleans up chaos and turns it into order. It's important for our evolutionary survival that we know whether those stripes out there are just random stripes or whether that is a pattern of a predator. So our brain is good at looking for patterns. So for me, a story is a pattern with meaning. And our brain is really good at looking for patterns and looking for meanings, even when there are no meanings there. So let me just give you one example. I can't see your faces, it's a real shame, but I'm going to show you a picture now. Maybe if you want to put it in the questions or chat, you can tell me what you think this is, and I'll tell you the answer. I'm just going to show you this picture. So if you want to just write something down, you can, and then Paul can tell me now or later, what is this a picture of? Most of you will say it's a sticky bun or it's a pastry. But I don't know if any of you are seeing anything else, because there's a good chance that you'll see a face. And if I ask you who that face is, some of you may say, oh, that looks like Mother Teresa. So if you're interested in this, it's called a pareidolia, which is an image that almost looks like something else. And our brain does this all the time. Our brain looks for patterns with meaning, and it overinvests things with meaning. So if you want people to listen, if you want to get them emotionally involved, create a story, create a pattern with a meaning. And please let me know if any of you realised it was Mother Teresa. By the way, obviously it is just a sticky pastry. It's nothing more than that. So let me end with my three topics, my top tips for telling transfixing tales. Again, it's three. One of my obsessions is, I think, across all the sort of businesses and domains that I work with, we spend way too much time thinking about content, what we say, and nowhere near enough time thinking about form, how we say it. I also realize that I'm working with people perhaps who are content managers, content producers. I think content is an overused word. Content is just stuff. You can have good stuff, you can have bad stuff. You can have interesting stuff, you can have dull stuff. Secondly, I'll talk about the importance of emotions, which I've already mentioned a bit. And thirdly, then I'll talk about one of my favorite expressions, the golden thread. So let's just have a couple of thoughts about form. If you take care of the form, the content will look after itself. We need to spend more time, as I say, thinking about how we create an argument, how we present, how we frame, and a bit less about what it is that we have to say. Again, please let me know if you think that's controversial. Happy to have the conversation. And I mentioned I was obsessed with etymology, I think, didn't I? Sure I did. If you look at the word information, we've forgotten, I think, the word that's at the heart of the word information. Information literally means giving shape to something. So for me, data is just stuff. Once you shape it, it becomes information. And for me, information is still not the end goal. The end goal is meaning. But bear that in mind. That's why information, you need to go back to the idea of form and of shaping, of molding, of knowing what you put in, and increasingly importantly, knowing what you have to take out. So I've sort of said this already, but it's worth saying again. I'd like us to have a bit less of an obsession with content, as I say, and think much more about form. And it's not just about storytelling, it's about understanding other aspects of persuasion, what's often called rhetoric. Again, as a classicist, I studied rhetoric from people like Cicero and Quintilian. But I found if I call my training day a rhetoric day, no one would come. So I call it storytelling. My second point, as I say, is emotions. Again, I'm just going to put this up for any people who've watched this series, particularly in Britain, but also elsewhere. This is a series called Line of Duty, which has been around for a few years. It's been a massive hit on the BBC. It's basically a sort of detective series. Why am I mentioning that? Because in the new book, the person that wrote that series, a well-known scriptwriter who also wrote a series called The Bodyguard, if anyone saw that in the UK or US or elsewhere, called Jed Mercurio. And he's a screenwriter. And he said this, and I think it's really interesting and relevant to what we're talking about. He says, if you disguise exposition, and exposition is like plot, but in our world, it's also facts and messages, information. If you disguise that with what he calls emotional overlay, it's rendered undetectable, which is his way of saying, if you actually have some emotional layer to what you're saying, if you get people's emotions involved, you can actually cover up all the facts and information because people care about what you're saying. If you don't have any emotion, it's very easy for people just to look at the facts, look at the information, and put it into attention span. So that's why it's so important to make sure that you think about emotions when you're creating a presentation, a speech, or any form of communication. And I mentioned the importance of surprise. For me, surprise is probably, and I do, again, a training day all about emotions and how you use them. But for me, surprise is still the one that is the most important one, that creates insight. And again, if you're interested in this book, I also run a book club, obviously. This guy talks about how Silicon Valley has weaponized surprise. Whenever we get a notification on Twitter or Facebook or whatever it might be, LinkedIn, we get a small buzz of surprise. Oh, look, someone sent me something, somebody loves me. And that's a neurochemical response because the brain literally gives us a small burst of, I think it's dopamine, every time we get a surprise. So literally we are chemically built to react to surprise, to be rewarded by surprise. So use surprise to reward your audience when you're trying to communicate and persuade them. So I've talked about form and content. I've talked about the power of emotions. Let me end this section by talking about the golden thread, which this is why the book is gold, why it's got a needle and thread on the front. And it does mean, again, for any classicists, please let me know if there are any classicists out there. It's such a rare treat to find anyone. Theseus and the Minotaur. So Theseus was an Athenian leader. And at the time, Athens had been beaten by King Minos of Crete. And Minos said to the Athenians, "You will give me 7 young men and 7 young women. They will come on a ship to Crete. They will be taken into the center of the labyrinth, a fiendish maze devised by Daedalus, the father of Icarus, who flew too near the sun. And in the center of the labyrinth, they will meet my son, the Minotaur, half man, half bull, and he will tear them limb from limb." Sorry if any of you are eating at the moment. And this went on for many years until, as I have to say, there arose a hero called Theseus in Athens. And he said, "I will go over to Crete. I will talk to King Minos and I will slay," because that's what they did in those days, "I will slay the Minotaur and free all the Athenian youth." He goes on a ship, sails to Crete, he goes to the court of King Minos, and he announces his intentions to King Minos. But he also meets King Minos' daughter Ariadne. And as these things do, Ariadne fell in love with Theseus and Theseus with Ariadne. And Ariadne says to him, "Theseus, no one has ever been able to get into the center of the labyrinth. It's so complicated. And even if they did, they would never be able to slay the Minotaur. And even if they had gone in, and even if they had slain the Minotaur, they would never find their way out safely." So according to different authorities, she gives him a ball of thread. Some say it was gold. And she says, "Unravel it at the beginning of the labyrinth. So when you get into the center, you'll be able to find your way back out safely." And that's what happens. And for me, it's a lovely story, but it's also a metaphor or an analogy for creating a structure, a framework in your presentation. If all you have is data and facts, it's very easy to get stuck in attention span. If you create a golden thread that runs through what you're saying, it's easier for the brain to have something coherent that it can hold on to, so it doesn't literally lose the thread. It's a lovely metaphor. Other metaphors are available. One of them is from a famous storyteller called Philip Pullman, who wrote Northern Lights. Please tell me you've all read Northern Lights. And he says, for storytellers, it's a bit like creating a path through the woods. So all the other facts, all the other information, the trees, the foliage, that's the analogy. But it's the storyteller's goal and role to create a path through the woods which he can guide the reader, the viewer, the listener through. So what does that mean? It means that a golden thread has to do all of these things. It's about editing. It's about understanding, as I said earlier, what stays in, but also, probably more importantly, what you have to take out for that thread to be clear and clean and concise. A hypothesis is a perfectly good way of looking at what a golden thread is. What if we do this? What if we change from X to Y? A story, a golden thread is also a point of view. POV is my company name, incidentally. But again, it can be a point of view, an angle, an argument. But the most important thing of all is it has to be coherent. If it's coherent and holds together, then the brain will listen, be emotionally involved, and not put it into attention span. If you want one other metaphor, someone once said this about art, that the most important part of the picture is the frame. Why? Because the frame is the barrier between what's important and what isn't important. So whether you call it the frame, the golden thread, the path through the woods, for me, that is the single most important thing that you have to create. Otherwise, as I said, you risk getting stuck and sunk in attention span. I'm going to tell you my Picasso story. This is probably apocryphal, probably not true, but it's a great story. A journalist comes to see Picasso in his studio in Paris, and she's there to do an interview with him about his art. So she goes into the studio, and it's just full of amazing artworks, Demoiselle d'Avignon, Guernica, etc. Just loads and loads of famous artworks. But her eye is taken at the back by the sculpture, a sculpture of a lion. And she just can't take her eyes off it. She's completely overwhelmed with this sculpture of a lion. So she says to him, Pablo, because they were on first name terms, Pablo, how do you do that? How do you create that sculpture? And Picasso said, it's actually quite easy. I take a big block of marble and I take away everything that doesn't look like a lion. Just going to pause for that one to ripple through. Again, that's what you're trying to do in your presentation, in your argument, in your document. You find your lion and then you take away everything that doesn't look like a lion. Again, it's probably not a true story, but it's a great one. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts at the end, and then I think we're finished. Another way of looking at the golden thread is a good three-letter acronym, TLA, as they're called. The signal-noise ratio. I want you to think about identifying what is signal, what is important, and reducing the noise, what is unimportant. It's really easy to create a presentation, an argument, a speech that is 100% noise. It's impossible to create one that's 100% signal, but that's what we need to do. Upweight the signal, reduce the noise. The more noise you have, the harder it is for the signal to sound out clearly, coherently as a golden thread. And before you ask me, I'll tell you a story about a client of mine who I, for obvious reasons, will keep anonymous. She said to me, I've got a big presentation to do to my team. I said, okay. She said, yeah, I've got to tell them 13 things. No, you can't, I said, slightly a bit more diplomatically than that. I said, you can't tell people 13 things. You can tell them probably 3, magic number 3. But I have to, no, you can't. You simply cannot do that. The brain will not take it. So we worked and tried to do a way of turning those 13 into 3 higher level ideas that she was going to try and communicate, which is a form of elevating the signal over the noise. Because yes, you want to elevate signal, but you can't also have 13 signals, because 13 signals become noise. So it's really important that you establish what you think the most important signal is, that you try not to have too many signals, and then that's, once you've done that, you try and take away everything that doesn't look like a lion. It's a mixed metaphor, but you get my point. My second acronym, every time you are preparing a document, every time you're writing a slide, every time you're writing a slide in a presentation, every time you're writing a point, a bullet point on a slide, every time you're writing a point, a sentence in a Word document, or in an email. Everything I've talked about, by the way, applies to emails as much as it does to presentations. Ask yourself this: is it true but useless? A lot of the time, we put stuff into our presentations, our documents, which is perfectly fine. It's true, it's good, it's not wrong, it's not inaccurate. But is it meaningful? Is it relevant? Is it part of the thread? Is it a line? And if it isn't, take it out. Yes, it's hard, it's difficult to eliminate stuff. Creative people, going back, I think, to Ernest Hemingway, talk about the art of killing your babies. Every creative person, when they have to sacrifice ideas or words, they know how difficult it is. As we're almost ending, I'll tell you my story of this book. The first book, the storytelling book, which was originally 75,000 words. And I had a publisher, it was going to be published. I was really quite happy. And then 2 things. Firstly, my editor sent me an email saying, look, I've got to leave. I'm coming back to the UK. And he said, don't worry, everything will be fine, which, as anyone who knows that expression, is one of those expressions that always means the opposite of what it says. A bit like with all due respect. So obviously 2 weeks after that happened, the publisher said, no, we changed our mind, we don't want to publish it. So I was very upset and quite annoyed. But then the publisher, the editor, turned up in London about a year later and said, look, Taz, let's have a cup of Earl Grey tea and we'll have a talk. And he said, look, I'm now running this company. We have this range of books called Concise Advice. They're very slim. But if you can reduce your book from 75,000 words to about 27, 28,000, I'll publish it. So I then had the challenge. Do I want to keep every one of those precious words that I'd crafted lovingly, or would I rather get a smaller book published? And I went for the smaller book published. So I had to cut out 47,000 of my best words. Yes, it was painful, but A, I did it, and B, it was worth doing. It's the same principle as the lion, the golden thread, and true but useless. And I'm going to leave you, I think now, actually I'm going to leave you with my last quote, which again is from the recent book. Because I don't know if any of you are designers or art directors or interested in art, but I discovered a while ago a man called Abram Gaines, who was a war artist for the UK government, the British government during the Second World War. And he designed loads and loads of fantastic posters to encourage people in the war effort. And he was even given the office of Chief War Artist by Winston Churchill. And they had arguments and they fell out. But some of his ads, his posters, were extraordinarily powerful and memorable. And in researching about him for the new book, I discovered that he said something which I'd never heard before, and I don't think I've ever seen a better and more succinct definition of communication than this. He says, all communication should be about maximum meaning and minimum means. I know it's 4 words, not 3, but it's got alliteration, it has a rhythm, but the most important thing about it is it's extraordinarily concise, and I think it's extraordinarily relevant. That's what we're trying to do in our communication, not facts, not information, not data, but to create as much meaning as we can for our audience in the minimum means: simple, concise, powerful, and emotional. Which I think brings me to the end. If you liked anything I said, as I said, Twitter is Tazwellhill, that's my email, anthonytaz.yahoo, and there I am on LinkedIn as Taz Tazgall. So I hope you enjoyed that. I'm now going to hand back, I think, to Paul. Hopefully there are some questions, and I shall have a sip of my Earl Grey tea. Thanks very much.
Excellent, thank you, Taz, and obviously a great presentation, really insightful, a lot of good takeaways. So obviously we've had some questions come in. Before we go to the questions, just to remind everyone that if you do have any questions, please type them in, and obviously we'll put them forward to Taz, and hopefully we can get through all those questions in the Q&A section. But I thought, obviously, you showed us a photo during the presentation. Obviously, you put it forward to the audience to send in their thoughts, what they thought the image was. So I thought I'd just send a couple of the questions which have come in. So a lot of people said a croissant. We've had someone say a hat, a cape, donut, sweets, pizza dough, a cloth, toast, and obviously a face. So obviously they're what people have been typing in throughout the session. Obviously that's obviously what you wanted to hear from that section. So we'll go into the Q&A section now. So we're going to kick it off with someone who has actually read the storytelling book and actually really loved it. So this person works in a data obsessed company. Yes. And her question is that she puts forward stories to the board, and obviously they like listening to them, but they demand to have back data to obviously back the story. She's asking, is there any tips for convincing others to get on board with a story?
Big question, and thank you for liking the book, and please say hello afterwards. I think what I found over the years of working with lots of different audiences Paul and questioner, is it's about understanding your audience. As somebody that's worked in marketing, that's rule 101, is you understand your audience. And different audiences probably want different things. So if you've got an audience who are happy with stories, please go all along and go with stories. If they need a bit more data, you can sew the data in. But two things. One is, I don't mind data being there, but as long as it's subservient to the thread. As long as the thread and the story is clear, the data then supports the story. It supports the thread. What I don't like is if all you have is data and facts and details. And I know some clients like that. Some clients just want a catalogue of facts. But what I'm trying to do now more and more is work with clients all the way from board level down to every single level and say, if we can work out a way of efficiently using data, but also creating stories, we can all be more effective presenters, but also we can be more efficient presenters. We'll waste less time showing loads of facts that not everyone wants to see, and also creating longer decks that no one wants to read. So I think it's about changing the culture. It's really about trying to get people to see the value of having a golden thread, having stories, how to use headlines, how you start, how you end, all the tips that I talk about in the book, and then working with them together and saying this will make you more efficient and more effective. Is that a reasonable answer?
Perfect, excellent. So we've had a few questions come in. Obviously, I'm going to put them all into one, but they're trying to obviously understand what's your favourite brands who have been good at storytelling, especially around the COVID time, and obviously got their word out and obviously built and improved the brand.
Yeah, I think brands that have been honest, and I don't necessarily want to use the authentic, I think have been very good. I think the supermarkets in the UK, for example, have got it just right. They haven't overclaimed, they haven't said that they're solving the world and saving everyone, but they've been very good about just saying we're there, we're helping, we're doing our best. And I think at a very low level, I think they've created a really good sort of amount of empathy and caring. I think other brands, before and during COVID are very good at stories. Obviously, people like Apple, who are probably the best example of realizing you don't have to be obsessed with facts and technology and spec. You can create a brand which is all about story and fun and excitement and creativity. So I think those are a couple of examples that I really think have done very well. Also, governments. I think this is a slightly different answer to the question, but in terms of what people have done during COVID. Again, if anyone's interested, I do training on behavioural economics, as I mentioned, and lots of governments have used emotions and stories to get people to comply. So our government did the rule of three. Stay at home, protect the NHS, save lives. But other governments and other organisations have used a much more emotional, story-led approach. So Ukraine, for example, I can't show it to you now, but again, if anyone's interested, I can maybe send it to them. Their government did something in collaboration with their Ministry of Culture, which was interesting, and they showed paintings, famous paintings. So they had a painting of Magritte, the guy with the bowler hat, except he had a face mask on, saying, make sure when you go out, you cover up. They had a famous picture of Napoleon on his horse carrying a delivery. So again, it was about don't go out to get food, use a delivery, which I thought was a really interesting way of making a very difficult subject, particularly given what was going on with the pandemic, but creating a sort of emotional feel, using stories, using art, using images. So I think those are just off the top of my head some examples, if that's okay.
Excellent, thank you. So we've had a question just to follow up from the first question. So the question is, when your job is to provide objective data, statistics, but storytelling is subjective and not what your boss expects, how do you do your job of statistics and simultaneously make people care about the data rather than your subject?
I'd love to know who said that and where they're from. I need about 3 hours to answer that question. It's a great question, and it comes to the heart as I mentioned, I work with strategy. I work a lot with data and research myself. It's always an issue about this subjective objective issue. I'm of the belief that there is no such thing as pure objectivity, even numbers. Someone once said, you can interrogate data and make it say anything. So I don't think it's a fresh break between subjective and objective. Again, if you look at what governments are doing, politicians are doing, teachers are doing, we are all telling stories with numbers. So my point is, I don't think it is either or, I think it is both and. If you happen to be dealing with people, and this may be what this question is about, who are believers in the sanctity of data and the sanctity of objectivity, firstly, send them on one of my courses. But secondly, I think it's worth saying to them, as I answered in the first question, for me, you can do both. You can tell a story which is true to data. Yes, you may have to say on the one hand X, on the other hand Y. And again, I often find myself doing that with the presentation. There may not be one story that fits everything. But my point above all is if you have no story and all you have is data, firstly, there's a good chance that your audience won't be emotionally involved. And secondly, I think the problem is, and again, it goes back to someone once said about history. History is just one damn fact after another. If your presentation is just one damn statistic after another, what have you got? You haven't got anything that the brain can really latch onto. So as I've been saying all along, the idea of coherence is at least try and make that data connect with each other to tell something like a story. But to be fair to the person that asked that question, it really needs 3 hours. And probably 3 hours of me talking with their team.
Excellent, thank you, Taz. So moving on to the next question. I think we've got about 3 questions to the end. So the question is, what do you think is the most common reason that people don't reach their full potential at work, and how can managers improve this?
Wow, that's a big question. Full potential at work. Do you know what? Whoever it was asked the first question who's read the book, you'll read at the end that I called it a happy ending, because what I wanted to talk about was happiness, which is obviously a big thing. And I do talk about happiness, behavioural economics. And I said this is about what it says, the story of your happiness. I genuinely think that one of the ways that people will be happier and more fulfilled at work is if they're allowed to tell stories, to be more emotional, to allow their brains to wander. Again, my whole book on Inspiratorium is about serendipity. I think if we want to have better work lives, we need to allow ourselves, as I say, to wander. Again, possibly my last bit of etymology, but possibly not. Error, we talk about error as if it's a mistake, a fault. If you look at the etymology, errare, originally it meant to wander. And it's a meaning that we still find in the word erratic. If you're driving erratically, you're wandering over the road. I think if we want to be happier and more fulfilled in our jobs, whoever asked that question, one of the things that we need to do is be allowed to wander, to have other interests, to look just beyond the market that we work in. I used to work, as I said, in ad agencies, and I used to work, for example, with Cadbury on chocolate, on Peugeot on cars, on Evian on water, on charities. I don't think I would have enjoyed it and found it as interesting if I just worked on one thing all the time. But when you work in different areas, your brain makes new connections. I have, again, a quote when I'm talking about insight, which is that information is to be collected, but insight is to be connected. And I think, again, if we look at how the brain works and happiness and creativity and insight, for me, I know it's a very big question and I can't do justice to it, just in one area. But I think being able to tell stories, allowing your brain to wander, looking at different elements, disciplines, worlds. So, for example, I mentioned I help run a cinema. I've often taken clients to see a film at my cinema, and then we'll talk about the film and what it means for their market or their brand, which is really unusual. It's really left field, but everyone enjoys it. And we always come up with a different insight and a different way of framing the issues for that client. So that's what I would say. Again, I wouldn't say it's superficial, But it's a very complex question, but that's what I would say first of all.
Thank you. So we've got time for obviously 2 more questions. So there's been a question coming in around building personal brand. So what they're asking is, do you have any tips around building a personal brand, and how can you stand out in a crowd on social media platforms?
Yeah, God, good questions. But these are all really meaty questions. I think personal brand is one of those things where you have to be slightly careful that you don't get into sort of weird territory. But I do generally think, and I speak as the owner of several grown-up children, and I lecture university students, and this is a question that comes up a lot, particularly when I'm looking at people writing their CVs or writing about themselves on Twitter or writing something on LinkedIn. The most important thing you have to be, I think, I can use the word authenticity, but I think you should find something about yourself which is genuinely interesting. It can be a passion, it can be a language, it can be something which just marks you out and is salient, as we say in the trade, that jumps out, that's different. And try and make that something that looks appealing to your audience. Because otherwise, if everyone says the same thing which they do on their CVs or on their LinkedIn profile, you know, I'm a young, interested person who's into social media with a really varied, everyone says that. And therefore, it's very hard for an employer or whoever it is you're talking to make you look different. You have to find something, some angle, some point of view. Again, I talked about it, I think, in this talk, my company name, POV. If you haven't got a point of view about politics, the world, the particular market that you're looking at, the client that you're talking to, about film, about art, about theatre, about books, find one, because it will give you some sort of hypothesis, angle, again, possibly even a golden thread. So that's what I would say. If you want to use brand personality words, again, play around with the sorts of words you might think other people would describe you as. I have also got other techniques that I use, for example, on video, again, to get people to think about creating a personal brand, but I think we're running out of time and it would take me far too long to give you specifics. But I hope that's just, you know, just again, an indication of what you can do.
Thanks, Taz. So we'll finish it with the final question. The question is, what will be your advice to managers who struggle to structure stories or who feel nervous about their narrative?
Again, a good question. The very simple, banal answer is just come and see me, obviously. But you know, without being quite so you know, glib, it is a lot about confidence. But the reason I talk about the golden thread or the path through the woods is I find that actually really does work. I think a lot of the reasons people don't feel comfortable with narrative and they feel worried is that a lot of the presentations they do are frankly A, quite dull, and B, go all over the place. So that if you lose your way, you suddenly think, oh my God, I'm gonna be embarrassed in front of this big audience. If you have a golden thread and it's simple to remember, it does actually make you feel more confident. So for example, my last tip, the rule of 3, which I mentioned. If you've got a presentation, a simple trick, divide it into 3 parts, as I did. Remember, or give each of those 3 parts a title, a word, an image that you can remember. And then just remember those 3 things. And it's amazing how much of your brain will actually be able to tell that whole story, particularly, for example, if your laptop dies or you have a tech problem. So I find that helping people come up with a thread just makes them more confident, because at the back of their brain, they actually have this thread. They know roughly what the story is. So they don't always feel that they have to look at every word and every slide. So that's what I would say as again, a sort of reasonably straightforward answer to that question.
Excellent, thank you. And obviously, unfortunately, we are out of time. Just like to say thank you again for a great presentation and some fantastic answers to those great questions which have come in. All that is left to be said is that just to reiterate to the audience that a copy of the recording will be available a week from today. So you'll receive an email from Amber and BJ, which will have the link, and obviously you just click the link and you'll be able to access that recording. Our next webinar is taking place on the 13th of July at 12 PM BST. and that's with Carolyn Poster, and she'll be presenting on how to make your marketing as binge-worthy as a TV series. So if you'd like to join that webinar or any other webinars, then please head over to our website, which is the www.associationofmbas.com, to register, and obviously to view all the up and coming webinars too. So all that's left to say is obviously thank you again, Anthony Tazgall, for a great session. It's been fantastic, really taken a lot away from this session, and we look forward to seeing our audience at our next webinar in July. Thank you again.
Thank you.